Welcome to Location Filmmaking, and this is a series of video lessons to keep you in tune for our progress. So the first one that we want to talk about, and that's the basic, and this is lenses. Lenses are integral to part of filmmaking because without a lens, you have absolutely no image to be captured on your camera. So we're going to be talking about aperture, exposure, f-stops, focus, focal length, depth of field, and color temperature in various parts. So let's talk about what a lens is. Basically, it's like a tube, and it has a lot of glass elements that's inside, and its job is primarily to gather light and image. And without light and image, you will not have anything to record in your camera. So how you manipulate the lenses for it to be sharp or blur, for it to be zoom in or zoom out is entirely up to you and basically what your story needs. There are only three types of basic lenses that you need to worry about: the normal lens, wide angle, and telephoto. These three types of lenses are basically what you need. This is how they look like. Now I want you to look at this particular long lens. Notice how this lens is pretty long and it's like a tube. And inside these lenses, there are a lot of glass elements, and you can adjust the focus. You can also adjust it to zoom in and zoom out. So this long lens is like a telephoto lens, and then of course you have shorter lens like wide angle lens and normal lens like 50 to 55 mm kind of lens. So how do they work? Basically, an image comes through the lens and it collects all the color wavelengths that you need to give you color, and it will reverse the image upside down, and at the end of the camera you have what we know as a CCD card or a sensor, and the sensor would actually pick up all these images and it will convert it into digital imagery in terms of ones and zeros for your computer to understand, so then it can replicate the real image. Now, even though you have the lens, how much you control light that enters your lens is known as exposure, because the CCD sensor at the end of the camera needs light for it to have for it to replicate the image. So without you controlling the exposure, you may have an image that's too dark for the camera to even see. So let's talk about exposure and what exposure really means.
Light is one of life's most necessary elements. It gives plants energy, our earth warmth, and it helps our eyes to see color and shape. For these reasons and more, light is very important for cameras. If it is controlled right, the sensor can easily define shape and capture a clean image, which can help you make a video that impresses those around you. Controlling light in a camera starts with controlling exposure. Exposure refers to the length of time that a camera's imaging device gets hit by light. Here's how it works. First, light passes through the lens of a camera, stopping at the diaphragm or iris. The iris, which acts much like the iris in our eyes, opens slightly to let in less light, or wider to let in more light, depending on the strength of the light coming into the camera. Once it passes through the iris, in some cameras, it passes through the shutter gate. The shutter gate covers a sensor for a determined length, then opens to let light in. Lastly, light reaches a sensor where the photons that make up light are captured, collected, converted into electrons, and read by a computer. The more electrons in each pixel, the brighter that pixel will be during playback. The resulting ones and zeros then get written to a recording medium and read on a computer during editing or playback.
So, when light enters the iris, you can control the amount of light that enters the camera. There are a few ways to control. Number one is known as the aperture. As you can see here, these small little kind of fins can control the amount of light that enters into the lens. By adjusting these fins, you can allow a lot of light or very little light. Now, the smaller the hole, when the light enters, it also controls focus, which we will do more of these exercises in class. So let's talk about aperture first. It's basically an opening in the lens which light passes through. As I already mentioned, you can actually control the size to allow a lot of light to enter or very little light to enter. These so-called controls are modeled after a word called f-stop. Now, each f-stop has a number. You can either increase the amount of light by double, or you can even reduce the number of light by half. It all depends on how much you want light to enter. So this is how it really looks like. Okay, so you have, for example, a wide aperture. The reading could be f1.4 or f2. You notice the hole is really large, and as it gets smaller, the number increases to f16 or f22, and you have very little hole. The easiest thing to remember is that the higher the number of the f-stop, the smaller the hole. Okay, and the less number of the f-stop, the larger the hole. Now, not all camera lenses can do this. Okay, it depends on the make and model of the lens itself. And as I mentioned to you that the lenses can control focus, this is what I really mean. Okay, this is something as what we call depth of field, all right, which we will explain much later. So, for example, if you have an f2.8 and this particular hole is open, it allows a lot of light to enter. And notice at the center of this box here, right here, okay, this is the amount. This is a small little amount of line that it's focused. On the opposite contrast, as you open the hole larger, the area here, that's where it's in focus. And then you want more area to be in focus, you just close the hole. And you close the hole. And the hole gets smaller, and the area of focus become longer and longer. So a lot of autofocus cameras, they have very small aperture because they want the area, a long area, to be sharp. But in a lot of shows, especially drama series, where you have one person standing in front and one person standing behind, you want only one person to be in focus all the time, you have to open the aperture to its largest, and that we'll talk about that later. So let's recap what an aperture and f-stop is, shall we?
One of the most used methods of controlling light is by setting a camera's aperture. The aperture controls two main functions: the amount of light that hits the camera and the depth of field. The iris or diaphragm on a camera is a multi-bladed opening that controls how much light hits the sensor. Much like your eye, the wider the iris, the brighter the image gets. Aperture is measured in f or focal stops. Each stop down represents half the light that was previously entering through the lens. The tricky part to remember is that the higher the f-stop number, the smaller the opening. Because of this, f22 on a camcorder usually blocks the most light, while f1.8 usually means that the iris is wide open.
Now, after we talk about the iris, there's one more thing we need to talk about, and that is the shutter. All right, the shutter of any camera, okay, is basically known as the word shutter speed. It's the amount of time that the door opens up to allow light to enter per frame within the amount of seconds that you've set. So for example, if you set 1/50 shutter speed, that means within 1 second the shutter frame open up 50 times. So this is what is known as shutter speed.
When controlling light, it is also helpful to know the functions of a camcorder's shutter. The shutter is a window that sits in front of the sensor in a camcorder. This window opens for a short period of time to cut down the amount of light that hits the sensor. and to lessen motion blur. The simplest use for the shutter is to cut down on the amount of light that hits the sensor. By keeping the shutter gate open for only a short period of time, a sensor can gather very little light, making the image look darker. This can work well when in a bright outdoor environment. However, in a dark environment, the shutter is usually set to a slower speed. The most common use for shutter speed is to either create more or less motion blur in an image. Motion blur is when an object moves across the frame during the time that the shutter is open. This results in streaks where the object was in the frame. Motion blur can be eliminated by opening the shutter for a very short period of time, either 1/2000th of a second or shorter. This cuts down on the distance that the object can travel in the frame before the shutter closes again. A fast shutter speed is often used in sports videography as it leads to better definition during slow motion replays.
So, for shutter speed, it is very important for you to adjust the amount of speed that you want for your film. So if you have a person that's walking very, very fast in front, you may want to increase the shutter speed so that he doesn't look very blurry in your film. We will talk about that and demonstrate a bit more in class. This is end of part 1. Part 2, we will continue with camera and we'll talk about depth of field.